Welcome back to the Sixth Gear Garage. Last episode, Mikey from the Shop Spot helped me safely place this cab onto the restored frame. And now I've got pieces and parts of this truck all over the garage. I've got them in the bed, I've got boxes in the basement, so all I really have left to do now is just put it back together. And that should be easy, right? I think I remember where all that stuff goes. The first thing to do was swap the wheels and tires with the matching wheels and tires on the old frame. The big tires on the rear looked good, but I want all four to be the same size when it comes time to adjust the rake and suspension. First, I'm going to install all the things in the engine bay that will be easiest while the engine is still out. This is the brake booster from the Southern truck, and it is perfect for laser cleaning with just very light surface rust. But when I blow on it, you can hear air coming through. So that means the diaphragm inside is bad, so unfortunately, this one is junk. So I was stuck with using the very rusty booster from the Ohio truck, but I was able to clean it up nice with the laser cleaner. Because some of the rust was so heavy, I had to go back over those areas with the mini belt sander. Then gave it a coat of self-etching primer, followed by 3 coats of filler primer to fill in any remaining pits in the surface, followed by satin black paint. This truck was an automatic, but I'm using the manual from the parts truck, so here's the manual pedals. Here's one last look at an engine bay I would actually eat off of before it gets filled back up with parts. I painted this with Air Paint's 2K engine paint. Link to that episode is in the description. Next, I spent way too much time laser cleaning, sanding, priming, and painting every metal brake line and fuel line. I'm using Duplicolor's graphite wheel paint on all of these lines. None of this was ever in the original plan for getting this truck back on the road, but neither was gutting and repairing the engine bay. Now that the bay is looking fresh, I can't bring myself to put any dirty or rusty parts back into it. I started laser cleaning this OEM brake master cylinder, and then remembered that I had already purchased a new master cylinder for a 1-ton truck to match the 1-ton calipers I installed, which I would discover might not work with the 2-inch drop spindles I installed on this truck. More on that later. I almost forgot about the clutch line. Looking back, I should have definitely installed these fuel lines before I put the cab onto the frame. It is still possible to install them with the cab already mounted onto the frame, but it did involve a little persuasion and some swearing. And then I bolted them to the underside of the cab. I plan on reusing the original vinyl floor covering, but still wanted to have a somewhat matching metal floor underneath it. Once the blue paint cured, I climbed in and ran the harnesses through the firewall. The vinyl floor cover was filthy to begin with, plus it had been sitting in the bed for over a year now. A little dish soap and some elbow grease cleaned it right up. While that dried, I installed the parking brake. as I'm putting some of this wiring back in place, there's this little green emissions control box here, and the top bolt lines up right there. And you can see right above it that this wiring harness has just about worn through to the point where I'm going to wrap some more electrical tape around this. The wires inside aren't cut through just yet, but it was close. And that's just from 40 plus years of rubbing on the bolt that's in this hole here. So if you're having electrical issues, take a look up there, see if your wire's worn through. All good. Now that the interior was mostly together, I got back to work on the engine bay. Now that I have all of these brake lines, clutch lines, fuel lines, hoses, cables installed, now it's finally time to drop in the engine. Even though I've done the best I can to protect all the work I put into painting this valve cover and the engine in the engine bay, I'm still a little paranoid about dropping it down in there with this homemade hoist. So I'm gonna give Mikey from the Shop Spot a buzz here and see if he can give me a hand in smoothly guiding this engine down into this engine bay without doing any damage. Wait, I know how to reach him. $37,000 lumens. Oh wait, this is the wrong one. Here's the one I used for Mikey. Oh, I gotta go. What's up, dude? Hey, man. Ready to throw an engine in the Yoda?
Oh, yeah. Got fuel.
I cleaned my slightly used 22R clutch, flywheel, and pressure plate to remove any grease. Thread lock on the flywheel bolts and then torque them to 80 pound-feet. And don't forget the pilot bearing. And then the clutch and pressure plate. Except for one thing. I forgot step 1, to put the rear plate on the back of the engine. I time-lapsed reinstalling the engine because the process is the exact same as the step-by-step video I made showing how to remove it. I'll link that one in the description. In addition to being extremely careful not to scratch anything, the only difference now is we have to get the height and angle of the engine perfectly aligned with the transmission so that the input shaft will slide into the pilot bearing, and that can be a challenge. Once the engine mounts were lined up to the frame, we dropped a couple bolts in them to hold them in place, but didn't tighten them yet so that we could still wiggle the engine. Once we had a couple of bolt holes aligned with the engine and the transmission, we put some extra long bolts through them so that we could slowly tighten them to pull them together. Then we were able to slowly pull the input shaft into the pilot bearing by tightening all the bolts evenly. After that, I went back and replaced the long transmission bolts with the correct shorter ones. All right. Like Mikey just said, unveil the artwork. This is my vision. White valve cover and a clean white engine bay.
She's a beaut, Clark.
Pretty good. I couldn't find lower transmission brackets for the 20R engine, but I had some rusty ones from a 1987 22R that were a perfect fit. This is the throttle linkage assembly, and I can't think of any easier way to clean this than with the laser cleaner. Any surface that light can reach can be cleaned with the laser cleaner. The front bumper that was originally on the Ohio truck was smashed in. Luckily, the chrome one from the parts truck was in okay shape. I did goof here and refinished the bumper brackets from the Ohio truck, and they didn't line up with the bumper from the parts truck. The driver's side was alright, but the passenger side wasn't even close. After a quick visual comparison, I saw that the passenger side bracket was pretty crooked, so I swapped them out for the brackets from the parts truck. The parts truck was missing the metal shroud for the radiator, so I laser cleaned and repainted the Ohio one. By the way, I made a full video all about the laser cleaner. There's a link in the description if you're interested. This is the fuel pressure regulator needed to run the Weber carb. Now it's time to get the back half of the truck squared away. I need to get the taillights installed, but before I can do that, I have to install the wiring harness. And here's the one from the Southern truck. You can see it's been unfortunately modified. It's a little bit burnt and crunchy right there from when I cut out the floor. I see a couple of cut wires, which is never good. So let's go take a look at the harness on the original Ohio frame and see if that one's any nicer. Well, this one didn't catch on fire, so that's good. And unfortunately, this one has been modified as well. I didn't even need to unbolt that ground. Thanks, Ohio. And they're both kind of crappy, but at least I know the Ohio harness worked at one point not too long ago, so we're gonna go with that one. The Ohio harness did have a ground wire that started to corrode and get crunchy, so I cut out and soldered in part of the harness. This driver fender had almost a half-inch gap at the bottom where it met the door, so I couldn't even install the lower bolts. Remember, I discovered that this truck was previously in a front end accident, so I replaced the driver's side inner fender and front support with parts from the parts truck in a previous episode. Because I used straight parts from the parts truck, the original fender no longer fit correctly because it must have been tweaked as well. And the tire is actually resting on the inside of this lip here on the two-wheel drive fender. Before I go fighting this fender to get it to fit just perfect, I just remembered I happen to have some four-wheel drive fenders. I bought these from Colton Doyle a couple years back, and you can see they're pretty much junk, but they were only 20 bucks, and I bought them with the purpose of possibly using them on this truck, and this patina is gonna be a perfect match. I'm so glad I put this fender on. You can see the door gap that was really bad when I had the two-wheel drive fender on is now just like it should be. So this fender must have been tweaked at some point. And I love this nice surface rust patina and the chipping paint. Fits well everywhere, and now I have a lot more room. Remember, the tire was actually touching the inner fender before, and now I've got 2 fingers, give or take, depending on how rusty this part is. And the overall fender height, the opening is exactly the same as it was before, 23 1/4. But what's throwing the look off is the distance from this bottom corner to this bottom corner is about 3.5 inches wider than it was on the two-wheel drive fender. And all that means is that in an upcoming episode, we're going to fit some wider wheels and tires in this thing. The truck looks so dirty sitting so low, but it's sitting on the bump stops. So I adjusted the torsion bars to raise it up a little. And decided to go a little higher to raise it 1 inch total. I already rekeyed the torsion bars when I was rebuilding the front suspension, and that's why the anchors aren't hanging low enough to cause any clearance issues. So it's actually 1 inch higher than it was before. However, it's still barely sitting on the bump stops. They're not quite as smushed down as they were before. But I think this height looks absolutely perfect. So I'm gonna get this side to the same height and then trim down those bump stops. So now I have the suspension height where I like it. I just need to chop down this bump stop a little bit. And here's my next problem. The 1-ton calipers aren't compatible with the 2-inch drop spindles that move the whole hub and caliper up 2 inches, and now the top of the caliper is going to contact the upper control arm when I turn too much. You can see there's maybe an inch or so of clearance when the wheel is straight. So here is the one from the passenger side over there. You can see it's the opposite orientation. I have the brake line coming in over here instead of here, and then the bleeder is right here instead of right here. So if I'm going to mount this passenger side caliper on the driver's side like this, I'm not going to be able to bleed the brakes because the air rises to the top, and I'm going to have the bleeder valve on the bottom. Instead, I'll have the brake line on the top. So what I'll have to do every time I want to bleed these brakes is unbolt the caliper, pull it off, somehow hang it, and flip it over so that it'll be like this, and that'll put the bleeder on the top. Now, normally when bleeding a caliper, it is mounted on the hub and it has the rotor in between the pads. Now that won't be the case here, so I'll have to find a piece of wood, about 1 inch thick or so, and put that in there so that the piston doesn't compress and push the pads together. So, small inconvenience, but sometimes that's what you have to do when you mix and match parts. Well, I thought that would work, but my next problem is the top bolt goes right in front of the hole for the brake line. So in order to unbolt this and remove it and or install it, I'd have to unthread and remove the brake line, which means I'd have to bleed them again. So that's not gonna work. Then I wondered if I could just swap the bleeder and the brake line. Nope. I couldn't even use a 90-degree adapter without interfering with the caliper bolt. Here's what I'm dealing with. About 1/16 inch clearance at full droop. And the caliper slide contacts the upper control arm as soon as the suspension starts to compress. That increased the gap to about 1/8 of an inch, or about 3 millimeters for my non-American viewers. I've been beating this thing with a huge hammer for a while now, and you can see I've got a little bit more room. I'd say maybe a tiny bit more than 1/4 of an inch, but man, it's just not going to work out. I'm going to give up my ball joint flip. This helps get some extra lowering by mounting the ball joint on the top side of the control arm versus underneath it. I'm going to go back to underneath it, and that's going to give me an extra probably 1/4 inch. I have the suspension fully compressed, so this is all the way up, and still contacts. Then I realized that I never installed the stop bolts to adjust the steering angle. I headed out to the Ohio frame once again to grab them, but they were pretty crusty. That's better. They threaded right into the drop spindles, and after some adjustment, it worked. Got about a 1/2 inch of space, fully compressed. So between adjusting that stopping bolt on the opposite side, undoing the ball joint flip, and slightly bending up the outer lip of the upper control arm, both sides now clear. And that's gonna be it for today. I'm still waiting on some parts to show up in the mail to get this thing wrapped up. I still need some OEM parts to rebuild the shifter for the manual transmission. I need to figure out a solution for some custom brake lines. I ordered some blocks to get some more drop on the rear. And then last, add all the fluids, and if I did everything else right, it should start right up. Thanks for watching.